What
I am
would you
so
do
grateful to
if
you.
your millionaire
You
boss walked
saved my
in
child.
just as you did the
You were
one
kind,
thing
sir.
that
He
saved
is
his
safe
baby's
now.
life? And more importantly, why was a tiny child starving in a house filled with wealth? Today's story begins with a shocking moment that turned a simple housemaid into the only person a newborn could trust. Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? On a quiet October evening in Ashland, Oregon, a young woman with a broken heart stepped into a mansion that had forgotten warmth and unknowingly walked toward the child who would change her life forever. The air outside carried that familiar rustle of falling leaves, the kind that brushed across porches and old wooden steps in small American towns. Aria Solis paused at the iron gate of the Reeves estate, steadying her breath as the last glow of daylight slipped behind the hills. She wasn't used to houses like this, places with stone columns, sweeping driveways, and lights that turned on automatically when someone approached. They felt more like museums than homes, beautiful on the surface but hollow inside. As she walked toward the front door, her jacket tightened around her shoulders. The chill wasn't only from the October breeze. It came from something deeper, a memory she carried close to her chest, one she didn't talk about, even when people gently asked. Folks at the diner would say, "Honey, you've got a quiet sadness about you," and Aria would smile politely, as people do when they're trying to hold the pieces of their heart together. The door opened before she could knock. Mrs. Klein, the longtime housekeeper, offered a faint smile. "Evening, Aria. Mr. Reeves is still out. Come on in, dear." Aria stepped inside. The warmth from the heating system didn't match the atmosphere within. Everything looked perfect: gleaming floors, polished oak railings, art framed with museum glass, yet nothing felt lived in. No shoes by the door, no scent of dinner, no sound of music or conversation drifting from room to room. It was the kind of silence that reminded her of hospital hallways at night, the kind she had spent too many hours in. Mrs. Klein guided her through the main hall, speaking in that careful whisper people naturally use around babies. "You'll be helping with light cleaning and organizing some rooms. And if the little one wakes, just call me." "He's been having a tough time lately." Aria nodded. She had heard bits and pieces. Ashland was a small town, after all. Folks talked over coffee refills and across grocery aisles. They said Mr. Reeves rarely smiled anymore. They said the baby was always unwell. They said the second marriage hadn't brought the warmth people hoped he'd find again. But gossip was never the whole story. Aria knew that better than anyone. She followed the soft glow of a nightlight into the nursery. The pastel walls, the white crib, the tidy shelves, everything suggested care and intention. But the air inside felt restless, as if the room itself had been holding its breath for days. Evan lay in the crib, wrapped in a light blue blanket, his tiny fists curled close to his chest. His breathing was shallow, uneven, the way babies do when they're exhausted from crying. Aria approached softly, her steps instinctively slow. The moment she leaned over the crib, something inside her chest tightened a familiar, aching pull. She whispered like speaking to a memory, "Hey there, little one." His eyelids fluttered. A small sound escaped him. Not quite a cry, not quite a sigh. As she reached in to gently straighten his blanket, that ache inside her deepened. She didn't often let herself stay in moments like this, but tonight she couldn't look away. Not from him. Behind her, footsteps approached, steady, firm, the kind of step belonging to someone accustomed to moving through big spaces alone. Aria straightened, smoothing her shirt as Callan Reeves appeared at the doorway, removing his coat with a tired, practiced motion. He nodded politely. "Good evening. Didn't expect you this late." His voice was low, even the kind that carried both discipline and a quiet exhaustion. Aria offered a respectful smile. "Mrs. Klein asked if I could help tonight, sir." Callan moved closer, glancing at the crib. The tightness in his jaw eased for just a moment, but even that small shift said a great deal. This was a man who tried hard, perhaps too hard, to keep himself together. "He's been restless again," Callan murmured. "Didn't settle for a lease. Not for me either." Aria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the baby, watching the subtle rise and fall of his chest. Something about the rhythm tugged at her, something she couldn't quite name, something familiar in a way that felt impossible. She finally said quietly, "Sometimes babies know things before we do." Callan looked at her. then really looked. A flicker of curiosity, confusion, maybe even hope crossed his eyes. But before he could respond, Evan shifted, a small cry forming in his throat. Arya instinctively leaned closer, and Callan stood in the doorway, watching her with a stillness that held more weight than words. And for a moment, the silence in that grand, lonely house seemed to shift just a little. Evan's small cry trembled through the room, a thin, weary sound that made Arya pause with a tenderness she didn't fully understand. She rested one hand lightly on the crib railing and let the quiet wrap around them. She didn't rush, didn't lift him, didn't fuss. She simply stayed close enough for the baby to feel a steady presence. Sometimes that was all a child needed, someone who wouldn't disappear when the night grew long. Callan stepped farther into the nursery, his footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. He looked different here, away from conference rooms and responsibilities, more like a man trying to steady himself in a home that never seemed to settle. His tie was loosened, his eyes tired, and yet he watched Arya with a stillness that carried more emotion than words could have expressed. Evan whimpered again. Arya leaned slightly toward him, her voice no louder than a breath. "It's all right, little one. You're safe." The tiny boy shifted, his fists relaxing against the blanket. His breathing fell into a more peaceful rhythm, enough for Arya's chest to loosen as well. It was a small change, but she noticed it because she always noticed the small things. Callan exhaled quietly, almost to himself. "He doesn't calm for anyone," he said, not hiding his surprise. "Not even me." Arya kept her eyes on the child. "Babies sense kindness before they understand anything else," she answered softly. "Sometimes that's enough." He looked at her for a long moment, as though trying to understand how someone who had walked into his home just hours ago could bring such calm into a room that had known nothing but crying for days. Mrs. Klein appeared in the doorway, her voice a gentle interruption. "Checking in. Everyone all right?" Arya stepped back a little. "He's resting better now." The older woman smiled with that warm, knowing look only caretakers carried. "You've got a real gift, dear." "I?" Arya didn't reply right away. Compliments always felt heavier than she could comfortably hold. She brushed her sleeve, offering only a quiet nod. Mrs. Klein turned to Callan. "Dinner's in the warming drawer. You should eat a little." He hesitated, the resistance clear in his posture, but finally nodded. "I'll try." Once he left, the nursery returned to its gentle hush, the soft ticking of the wall clock, the faint hum of the heater, Evan's tiny breaths blending into a peaceful rhythm. Arya fixed the corner of his blanket with careful hands. She didn't allow her mind to wander often, but moments like this, fragile, unexpectedly tender-made memories, stir no matter how tightly she kept them locked away. Mrs. Klein touched her arm gently. "Go on home now, Arya. You've helped more than you know." Arya gathered her sweater and made her way through the quiet hallway. The lights glowed dimly along the walls, casting long, mellow shadows, warm, but still lonesome. When she stepped outside, the chill of the October evening brushed her cheeks. The scent of distant wood smoke drifted through the air, the kind that always reminded her of small-town porches and evenings spent wishing for something steady enough to hold on to. She walked partway down the stone path before something made her look back. One upstairs window glowed softly at the nursery. Through the delicate curtains, she could see a tall silhouette standing perfectly still. Callan. He wasn't moving, wasn't pacing or checking his phone. He was simply standing there, looking toward the crib, and then toward the space where she had stood moments before. His expression was hard to read from outside, but it carried something unmistakably human, an awareness he hadn't expected to feel, stirred by a moment he couldn't quite explain. And in that quiet frame of warm light, he looked like a man who had just witnessed something beyond understanding, something that shifted the air around him in a way he wasn't ready to name. Callan stood in the doorway, watching her long after she had gone, as if he had just witnessed something he could not explain. The next morning crept into Ashland with a soft gray sky, the kind that carried a hint of rain but didn't hurry it along. Main Street was just beginning to stir, lights flicking on inside the little bookstore, a delivery truck rumbling past the flower shop, and the familiar sizzle of breakfast griddles warming up inside the diner. Arya pushed open the door of Main Street Diner with the same gentle care she used everywhere lately. The bell above the frame chimed lightly, a sound that always reminded her of simpler years when mornings meant school buses, warm oatmeal, and the comfort of knowing the world could still be kind. Marlene, the older waitress with silver hair pulled into a tidy bun, waved her over. "Morning, sweetheart. You're out early." Arya managed a small smile. "Long night." Marlene poured coffee into a to-go cup, the steam curling upward like a soft greeting. "You look tired, honey. Sit a moment." "Oh." Arya hesitated but slid into the booth anyway. The scent of maple syrup drifted from the griddle, mingling with the earthy aroma of fresh coffee. A couple in their 70s sat near the window, sharing pancakes and reading the local paper together. The scene, quiet, familiar, felt like a warm quilt placed gently over her shoulders. Marlene leaned on the back of the booth. "How's the little one at that big fancy house? Still having a hard time?" Arya wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "He settled a little last night." "Well," Marlene said, patting Arya's shoulder, "some babies feel the world more deeply. They look for hearts that beat steady, not loud." Arya didn't respond, but the words settled inside her like a pebble in a still pond. After finishing half the cup, she thanked Marlene, tucked a tip beneath the saucer more than she could comfortably spare, and stepped back into the cool morning air. She walked toward Reeves' estate with slow, thoughtful steps, the golden leaves crunching beneath her shoes. By the time she arrived, the house stood quiet as ever. The silence inside was different from the diner, too polished, too careful, like a museum trying to pretend it was a home. She placed her things in the laundry room and headed toward the nursery. Evan was awake, his little face scrunched in discomfort, his breaths uneven. Elisa Warner stood beside the crib, perfectly dressed as if she were preparing for a luncheon rather than a morning with an infant. When Elise turned, her smile was tight. "Oh, you're here early." Arya nodded gently. "Mrs. Klein asked if I could start sooner today." "Well," Elise said, adjusting the silk scarf at her neck, "I hope you remember what we discussed. Keep your distance unless I ask." "Oh." The words weren't loud, but they carried that polished edge people used when they wanted to remind someone of their place. Arya kept her tone respectful. "Of course, I'm just here to help." Elise looked back at the baby with a sigh that seemed more impatient than worried. She picked up a bottle, tried to feed him, but Evan turned his face away, whining softly. "Oh, come on," she muttered. "You did this yesterday too." M6 Arya stood still, hands folded in front of her, watching the child's uneven breaths with a quiet ache. It wasn't her place to intervene, not after last night, not after Elise's warning, but it was hard to watch. Footsteps approached from the hall, slower than usual. Callan stepped in, his expression guarded but weary. "Is he refusing the bottle again?" "Yes," Elisa replied sharply. "And I'd prefer if Arya didn't try to comfort him this time." Callan didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the baby, then shifted to Arya. And for a brief moment there was something unspoken, a question, a memory of last night's fragile peace. Arya lowered her eyes. She didn't want to create tension, not in a home already stretched thin. Evan let out a small cry, thin and strained. Elise groaned softly. "Honestly, I don't know what else to do with him." "Oh." Arya's fingers tightened slightly at her side, but she kept quiet, breathing slowly so her voice wouldn't betray the pull in her chest. Callan tried to feed the baby himself, but Evan's discomfort only grew. His little legs kicked weakly, his face flushed with frustrated exhaustion. "Maybe he's overtired," Callan said. "Maybe he's something else," Elise muttered. Arya felt something inside her twist, an instinct, a knowing, the whisper of experience that never fully left her. But she didn't move. Not yet. Evan's cries grew sharper, a thin wail that filled the nursery like a thread pulled too tight. The child's face reddened with effort, and his tiny chest lifted in quick, shallow breaths. Arya stood still, her heart aching with every sound he made. She wished the ache wasn't so familiar. She wished she didn't recognize the frightened tremor in his voice the way she did. But once you've held a child through pain, your heart never forgets the sound. Elise paced once, then twice, her heels tapping sharply against the polished floor. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "He needs to learn to adapt. Babies do that." Arya kept her gaze on the crib, steady and quiet. "Sometimes," she said softly, "they're telling us something before they can speak." Elise shot her a look that could have cut through glass. "I didn't ask for your opinion." The room grew still. Even Callan seemed taken aback by the coldness in her voice. He shifted his stance, running a tired hand across his jaw before speaking. Elise, let's just take a moment. But Evan's cry rose again, thinner now, weaker. That sound pierced through Arya's composure. It was no longer the loud fussiness of a hungry child. It was a strained, breathless cry, the kind that tightened a mother's lungs with dread. Arya took a step forward before she realized it, then stopped herself, fingers curling at her side. "He's struggling," she whispered. "Something isn't right." Elisa rolled her eyes. "He's dramatic, that's all." Callan didn't speak, but there was a flash of uncertainty. No. Fear beneath the calm facade he struggled to maintain. He leaned over the crib, brushing a hand against Evan's cheek. The baby turned toward him but didn't calm. His breaths were now shuddering, uneven. Arya's pulse quickened. "He's exhausted," she said quietly. "He's trying, but he can't settle." Elise stepped between Arya and the crib, blocking her view as though guarding territory. "I said she's not to touch him." "I didn't touch him," Arya replied gently. "But he needs help." Callan straightened, the weight of conflicting instincts pressing hard on his expression. He looked from Elise to Arya, two women standing in the same room but worlds apart. Then Evan's cry broke again, a strained, gasping sound that clawed at the quiet. Arya's breath hitched. She remembered a night that sounded too much like this one. She remembered the monitors, the cold hands, the silence that followed. Her chest tightened painfully. Elisa, frustrated, thrust the bottle toward Evan again. "Oh, for heaven's sake, just eat." But Evan didn't. His head turned weakly to the side, his mouth trembling with effort. Arya closed her eyes a moment, steadying herself. She had promised to keep her distance. She had promised not to interfere. But there were promises you could keep only until a child's breath changed. "Elise," Callan said sharply, "stop. You're making it worse." Elise froze mid-motion, stunned by his tone. She lowered the bottle slowly, stiffly. Arya opened her eyes. Callan looked at her not with command, not with expectation, but with a silent plea. He didn't say a word, yet something in his expression whispered, "Tell me what I can't see." Arya stepped closer, her voice warm and low, the way one speaks to skittish creatures and hurting children. "His breathing is too shallow," she murmured. "He's tired past the point where he can calm himself. He needs steady contact, something familiar, stable." Elise scoffed. "Oh, so now you're some kind of expert?" Arya didn't react. Her attention stayed on Evan, whose fists were now trembling rather than clenched. Callan, voice low, asked, "What do you think we should do?" The question settled heavily in the room, surprising all three of them for different reasons. Arya answered carefully, each word chosen like a step on thin ice. "Let me sit near him, not touch. Just be close. Sometimes that's enough to help a baby breathe easier." Elise opened her mouth to protest, but the sound of Evan's strained cry cut through her argument. For a moment, a brief, flickering moment, even she looked frightened. Callan nodded once, slow but firm. "Do it." Arya approached the crib. She didn't reach in. She didn't lift him. She simply sat on the small, cushioned chair beside the crib and began to hum a tune so soft it blended with the quiet hum of the heating vent. The kind of melody mothers hummed on front porches at dusk without ever realizing they were singing. Evan's cry faltered. The next breath he took was deeper, not perfect, but better. Callan exhaled like he had been holding his breath for minutes. Elise watched the scene with something between disbelief and resentment tightening her shoulders. She didn't speak. Arya kept humming steady, gentle, a rhythm older than memory. And slowly, breath by breath, Evan's trembling eased. For a long moment, none of them moved. It was as if the house itself had paused, listening. Then, just when the quiet began to settle, Elise stepped back, her face paling as her phone buzzed sharply in her hand. She glanced at the screen. A message. From Grant. "We can use this. Don't let her get too close." Her fingers tightened around the phone as she looked toward Arya, no longer just with suspicion, but with something colder forming behind her eyes. Morning settled gently over Ashland, casting a pale gold hue across the small town, as if someone had dusted the rooftops with sunlight. The sidewalks were quiet, except for the soft sweep of a broom outside the hardware store and the distant hum of a school bus turning down a side street. It was one of those mornings that made the town feel older than it was slow, steady, unhurried. Arya pushed open the door of Main Street Diner, the familiar jingle of the bell greeting her with a warmth she hadn't quite felt anywhere else. The scent of pancakes, bacon, and strong coffee filled the room, comforting as an old quilt. She slid into a booth near the back, the one with the slightly crooked lamp and a view of the street. Marlene, the silver-haired waitress who'd been working here since before Arya was born, walked over with a knowing smile. "Well, good morning, sweetheart. You look like you've carried the weight of the whole county on your shoulders." Arya laughed softly, a small sound, but genuine. "Rough night." Marlene poured her a cup of coffee before she even asked. "Then this'll help fix whatever's trying to break you." She leaned in a little. "How's that little one? Still fussing?" Arya wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "He had a hard time, but he settled for a bit." Some babies," Marlene said, sliding into the seat across from her. "They don't care for bottles or lullabies or fancy cribs. They want steady hearts. They know when someone's truly there." Arya lowered her gaze. The words settled over her like a soft blanket, but beneath them echoed a memory she wasn't ready to revisit. Marlene reached across the table, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "You've got one of those steady hearts, honey. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Arya smiled, though it carried a trace of sadness. "I don't think everyone agrees." "Oh, folks talk," Marlene said, waving a dismissive hand. "But babies don't lie. They go where the comfort is." Arya didn't answer, but the truth of the statement lingered with her, long after she left the diner, tipping more than she should have into the glass jar by the register. She stepped out into the crisp autumn air, the leaves crunching softly beneath her shoes as she made her way up Maple Ridge Road toward the Reeves estate. The moment she stepped inside the mansion, she sensed the shift in atmosphere. Mrs. Klein's greeting was gentle as always, but there was a tightness in her smile, like she sensed a storm coming. "You might want to head upstairs, dear," the housekeeper murmured. "Mrs. Warner's already in the nursery." Arya's steps slowed. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Klein didn't answer directly. "Just be careful today." Arya walked toward the nursery, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached the doorway, she paused. Elise Warner stood near the crib with her arms crossed, her polished nails tapping against her forearm. Everything about her, her posture, her expression, the hard tilt of her chin told Arya that whatever peace existed last night had dissolved with the sunrise. "Oh," Elise said, her voice trimmed with frost. "You're finally here." Arya kept her tone steady. "Good morning." Elise stepped closer, heels clicking softly. "We need to make something very clear. Last night was unusual, but it won't happen again." Arya's eyebrows knit slightly. "I only did what was needed." He was struggling. "And yet," Elise interrupted, "you seem to think that gives you some kind of special authority." "I don't," Arya said, calm but firm. "I'm just trying to help." Elise's smile was thin, brittle. "Help. Right." She leaned in just a bit. "Let me be perfectly clear, you are staff, nothing more." For a moment, the room felt colder than the October air outside. Arya didn't respond. She had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when a child was in the room. A shadow crossed the doorway, Callan. He paused, sensing tension even before either woman turned toward him. "Is everything all right?" he asked carefully. Elise's smile turned sugary sweet. "Oh, darling, we were just discussing boundaries." Arya said nothing. She simply stepped aside, giving him space. But something in her eyes made Callan's expression shift just slightly, but enough. He nodded slowly, looking between them, weighing something silently. The atmosphere in the room tightened. And in that tightening quiet, something unspoken began to stir. Something that would grow into a storm neither of them could ignore. Callan took a slow breath, the kind of breath a man takes when he is trying to read a room without stepping directly into the conflict inside it. He looked at Elise first, her arms folded, her posture rigid, her chin lifted as if preparing to defend her place in a house she feared losing. Then he looked at Arya, who stood with her shoulders gently squared, hands clasped in front of her, as though grounding herself against an invisible gust of wind. "I just want everyone to feel comfortable," Callan said finally, his voice low and measured. "Especially Evan." Elise turned toward him, her expression smoothing into practiced softness. Of course, darling. That's exactly what I want too. But we can't have unnecessary attachments forming. Arya felt the words like a pebble dropped into still water small, but the ripples reached further than expected. She stayed silent, letting the two of them navigate whatever lay between their marriage, their expectations, and the fragile ground they both seemed to be standing on. Callan's gaze drifted to the crib. Evan was awake, his eyes glassy with fatigue, his tiny body curled into the smallest version of itself. The child hadn't cried yet this morning, but the silence itself felt strained, as if he didn't have the strength to cry again. Arya moved instinctively, just a small step, but Elise stiffened. "Don't," she said sharply. "I told you boundaries." Arya froze, her breath catching in her chest. "I wasn't going to touch him," she said quietly. "I just wanted to see if he was all right." "Well, he will be," Elise snapped. "With us." Callan rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture he made when conflict pressed too close. "Eliza," but she cut him off. "Do not undermine me in front of staff." Arya lowered her gaze. She knew these floors, these walls, these polished surfaces. Houses like this held echoes, and every raised voice left a mark. She stepped back, closer to the window, letting the morning light brush her shoulder like a quiet reassurance. Mrs. Klein appeared at the doorway, her eyes flicking quickly from Elise to Callan to Arya. She didn't say a word, but the look she gave Arya, soft, steady, felt like a hand on the small of her back, reminding her to breathe. "I'll handle the laundry," Arya said, her voice steady but thinner than usual. She stepped toward the hallway, but Evan whimpered just once, just a small, frail sound. Arya paused involuntarily, her heart clenching around the sound. Elise noticed. Her jaw tightened. "See? This is exactly what I mean," she hissed. "He's reacting to her. He needs to stop." Callan stared at Elise, startled. "He's a baby, Elise. He isn't choosing sides." "Then explain why he reacts to her," Elise snapped back. "Explain why yesterday he calmed down the second she came near. Explain why he cries whenever I pick him up." The room fell silent, heavy as a fog settling over the valley. Callan's voice softened, but it carried a weary truth. "Maybe he's just overwhelmed." Elise stared at him, her eyes glimmering with something raw, fear, resentment, maybe both. "Are you taking her side?" "No," he said gently. "I'm taking his." Arya's breath caught. She hadn't expected that, not from a man who had spent the last weeks trying to hold an unraveling household together with quiet determination. Elise said nothing. She turned away, as if retreating from a conversation she could no longer control. She adjusted a framed photo on the dresser, straightening a picture of herself and Callan from a year ago, smiling in the sunlight of Sonoma Valley before walking out of the nursery without another word. The door clicked softly behind her. Callan remained still for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then he looked toward Arya. "I'm sorry about that," he said, voice low. "She's going through a lot. We all are." Arya nodded slowly. "It's all right. I understand." She hesitated, then added softly, "I don't want to cause problems here." "You're not," Callan said more firmly this time. "Last night, you helped him. That matters. Arya met his gaze for a moment, just a moment, but in that brief exchange, something warm flickered between them, faint but unmistakable. Not romance, not yet. It was something quieter, recognition. As if both of them, in different ways, were carrying the weight of something they didn't know how to put down. Mrs. Klein stepped inside, her voice gentle. "Mr. Reeves, you have a conference call soon." He nodded and stepped away reluctantly. "If he cries again, call me." Arya watched him go, then turned toward the window. Outside, leaves drifted gently in the wind, brushing against the glass like whispers. The nursery felt different now. Still quiet, still heavy, but touched with a new kind of tension. Not loud, not hostile, but the quiet strain of a house where truths were pressing toward the surface. Arya picked up the laundry basket, but before she left, she allowed herself one small look at Evan. His eyes were open, watching her with a calm that carried something she didn't dare interpret, something she didn't dare hope for. She stepped into the hallway, unaware that down the corridor, Elisa stood partially hidden behind the wall, her phone still in her hand, her jaw tight, her eyes sharp with something darker than jealousy. Grant's message glowed on her screen. "Keep her away from him. We can turn this to our advantage." And as Elise read it again, a storm gathered quietly behind her composed expression, one that would soon sweep through every corner of the Reeves household. Ashland woke slowly, wrapped in the soft stillness of a cool October morning. Mist clung to the tops of the evergreens lining the neighborhood roads, and the faint smell of damp pine drifted through the air the way it often did after a night of light rain. The Reeves estate, usually silent at this hour, had a small stir of activity around it, house lights shifting from dim to warm, coffee brewing in the kitchen, and a distant lawn sprinkler turning in steady rhythm. Callan Reeves stood on the front porch with a travel mug in hand, staring at the quiet street beyond the iron gate. He rarely paused like this. His mornings were typically carved into rigid schedules, conference calls, project deadlines, emails waiting like restless birds. But lately, something in his routine had begun to loosen, as though the knots of his life were slowly untying themselves in ways he couldn't yet name. A door creaked behind him. "Morning, sir," Mrs. Klein said gently. She was holding a small basket of folded baby blankets. "I thought you'd already be on your call." Callan shook his head. "Pushed it back. Needed a moment." Mrs. Klein nodded, her eyes soft with the understanding of someone who'd watched him carry too much for too long. "There's nothing wrong with a breath of quiet now and then." He half smiled, sipping his coffee. "You've been saying that since I took over the company." "Because it's been true since you took over the company," she said, giving him a friendly tap on the arm. They shared a brief, familiar silence before Callan asked, "Elise left early?" Mrs. Klein hesitated. "She headed out about 40 minutes ago. Said she had errands." He nodded, though something in him tightened. "Did she seem all right?" he asked carefully. Mrs. Klein weighed her words. She was loyal to the household, not to anyone's ego. "She seemed on edge," she said gently. "But you know how she gets when she feels things slipping out of her hands?" Callan didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the quiet street again, less peaceful now, more uncertain. Inside the house, Arya had arrived early and was in the laundry room. She folded small onesies, careful to place them in neat stacks by size. Each piece of baby clothing carried a faint scent of lavender detergent, warm and familiar. The simple rhythm of folding helped settle her thoughts. She heard footsteps, small, quick ones, and looked up to find Mrs. Klein in the doorway. "Morning, dear." "Morning," Arya replied with a gentle smile. "I'm almost done with these." "No rush," the older woman said. "Take your time. He's still asleep, and I'd rather his morning stay quiet." Arya nodded, grateful for the steadiness in her voice. "Did everything settle down after yesterday?" Mrs. Klein sighed softly. "Settle is a strong word, but the house has a way of absorbing tension when night falls." Arya didn't push for more. She folded the last onesie, placing it in the basket with an attentiveness that came naturally to her. Mrs. Klein observed her for a moment, then spoke gently. "You handled yourself well yesterday. Better than most would have." Arya looked down. "I didn't do anything special." "You did," Mrs. Klein insisted, stepping closer. "You listened. Most folks forget how to do that." Arya felt her chest tighten, not painfully, but with a kind of longing she rarely acknowledged. No one had said words like that to her in a long time. A door opened upstairs, interrupting the quiet moment. Evan began to fuss a soft, groggy sound rather than a cry. It drew both women's attention. "I'll go," Arya said softly. Mrs. Klein nodded. "Go on, dear. I'll bring up a fresh bottle." Arya walked up the staircase, her steps naturally gentle, as if she didn't want to disturb the house's fragile calm. When she entered the nursery, the morning light filtered through the pale curtains, casting soft patterns across the crib. Evan lay awake, his tiny fists resting near his cheeks. He wasn't crying, not yet, but his breaths were raspy, uneven, the kind that hinted at discomfort rather than distress. Arya approached slowly. "Hey there," she whispered. "Rough morning?" The baby blinked up at her, his expression weary but trusting. It pulled at something deep inside her, something she thought she had buried long ago. She didn't pick him up. She only placed a hand on the edge of the crib, her presence enough to ease the tiny tremble in his breaths. Downstairs, Callan closed the front door and began walking toward the hallway. His steps were quieter than usual, thoughtful. As he reached the staircase, he paused when he heard Arya's soft voice drifting down. He stood there a moment longer than needed, listening, not because he was checking on anything, but because the calm in her voice felt like something he hadn't heard in a long time, something he didn't realize he'd been missing. Arya stayed by the crib, her voice low and steady, letting the quiet fill the spaces the house never seemed able to hold on its own. Evan watched her with heavy eyelids, the faint rasp of his breathing slowly evening out. She brushed a fingertip lightly across the blanket, not touching him, just smoothing the fabric, and the motion alone seemed to bring a fragile peace to the room. Down the hall, Callan stood still for another moment before stepping into the nursery doorway. He cleared his throat gently so he wouldn't startle her. Arya turned, offering a small smile. "Good morning, Em." "Morning," he answered, his voice softer than he intended. He stepped closer, careful not to intrude on the quiet she had built. "He seems calmer." "He's trying," Arya said. "He had a rough start, but he's settling." Callan leaned over the crib, looking at his son with the kind of worried tenderness men often hid behind their routines. "I feel like I'm always one step behind with him," he murmured, "like I'm missing something important." Arya hesitated before speaking. "You're here. That matters more than you think." He looked up at her then, a brief, searching glance that held more vulnerability than he would ever admit aloud. She didn't flinch or look away. She simply met his eyes with the quiet steadiness she seemed to carry so naturally. Mrs. Klein entered with the bottle, moving gently, as if not to disturb the delicate moment. "Here we are," she whispered, "warm and ready." Arya instinctively stepped back, giving Callan space. He reached for the bottle, but even as he tried to feed Evan, the baby squirmed weakly and turned his face aside. "It's all right," Arya said softly. "He just needs a minute." Callan sighed, lowering the bottle. "I don't want to force him." "You're not forcing," she assured him. "You're offering." The simplicity of her words lingered between them like a warm draft from an open window. Callan turned the bottle in his hand, thoughtful. Before either could say more, footsteps echoed sharply from the hallway heels, striking wood in a way that carried tension with every step. Elise appeared in the doorway, her expression taut, her eyes immediately narrowing at the scene before her. "Well," she said coolly, "isn't this cozy?" Callan straightened, the spell of the moment dissipating instantly. "He woke up early," he explained. "We're trying to settle him." "Of course you are," Elise replied. Her tone was sweetened, but only in the way honey turns brittle in cold weather. She approached the crib, assessing the situation with a sharpness that felt personal rather than maternal. Arya stepped aside, keeping her posture respectful. Elise lifted a hand to take the bottle from Callan. "You can go. I'll handle this." But Evan whimpered the moment she leaned over him, his small body tensing as though bracing for discomfort. Callan froze not at the whimper, but at the look that flickered across Arya's face. Concern. Familiar, instinctive concern. Elise noticed it too, and her jaw tightened. "I said I'll handle this." Callan spoke gently but firmly. "Elise, maybe we should let him calm a bit first." She turned to him, stunned. "You're siding with her again?" "I'm siding with him," Callan repeated calmly. A cold, deliberate silence settled over the room. Elise set the bottle down with a controlled motion, then inhaled sharply. "I'm late for my appointment," she announced. "I'll be back this afternoon." She brushed past them both and left with quick, clipped steps. The moment the front door closed downstairs, the house seemed to exhale. Callan ran a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "She's been under pressure." Arya shook her head. "It's all right. You don't need to apologize to me." But he looked at her with a depth that suggested he disagreed. "She shouldn't speak to you that way," he said quietly. Arya didn't know how to answer, so she simply offered a gentle nod and turned back to the crib. Evan's breathing had steadied again, and she hummed a soft tune, the same one that had calmed him the night before. Callan watched her for a moment longer, then finally stepped away. He paused in the doorway, glancing back at the small, peaceful scene before heading toward his office. Downstairs, the sound of a car engine faded down the street. Elise drove with rigid posture, her hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The further she got from the house, the easier it became for her thoughts to slip into the cold, calculating rhythm she used to steady herself. She pulled into the back parking lot of a quiet cafe 3 blocks from Main Street. No one noticed her step out or slip into the booth in the far corner. Grant was already there. He looked up, expression sharp. "You're late." "Things were complicated," Elise muttered, sliding into the seat. Grant leaned forward. "We can't afford complications." Elise stared out the window, jaw tight. "She's getting too close. He trusts her." "The baby responds to her. And Callan, he listens to her more than he listens to me." Grant's expression darkened. "Then we'll use that." And Elise turned slowly toward him. "How?" A thin, dangerous smile formed on Grant's lips. "Simple. If she's the reason things fall apart, then she'll be the one they blame." Elise's breath trembled, not in fear, but in the chilling realization of how far she was already willing to go. The afternoon sun spilled gently over Ashland, warming the sidewalks and casting long shadows across the Reeves estate lawn. The house seemed calmer than it had in days, wrapped in a soft quiet as though it too was trying to breathe a little easier. Inside, Arya moved slowly through the nursery, careful not to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the room. Evan was nestled in her arms, not fully asleep, but drifting in that half-dreaming state babies slipped into when they finally felt safe. His tiny fingers curled around the edge of her sweater, holding on with a trust so pure, it made Arya's heart ache in ways she rarely allowed herself to feel. She hummed softly, rocking just slightly, more for him than for herself. The nursery window was open an inch, letting in a cool, pine-scented breeze. Outside, a few golden leaves fluttered down the driveway, their dance slow and unhurried. Mrs. Klein peeked in with a gentle smile. "He likes you," she whispered, as though speaking too loudly might break the moment. Arya brushed a calming hand over the baby's back. "He just needs quiet," she murmured. "And someone close." "That may be true," Mrs. Klein replied. "But he chooses you. Not everyone is chosen." Arya didn't answer. She simply looked down at the child, her heartbeat syncing with the tiny, rhythmic breaths rising against her chest. The warmth of him, the small weight, it was enough to pull old memories forward, the ones she had tucked away so carefully. Mrs. Klein stepped closer. "Would you like me to take over?" Arya shook her head gently. "No, he's all right for now." And he was. His forehead rested against her shoulder. The tension in his small limbs eased. She didn't know how long she sat there, 5 minutes or 50. Time had a way of bending when a child was calm in your arms. Downstairs, Callan ended a conference call early and stepped out onto the landing. The house was unusually quiet. Too quiet. He listened a moment, following his instincts more than any sound. His feet moved toward the nursery almost without thought. He paused at the doorway. Arya sat by the window, Evan curled against her, sunlight warming the side of her face. The scene pulled something deep inside him. Not jealousy, not longing. Something softer recognition again. The same gentle ache from the night before. He cleared his throat lightly. Arya looked up, startled, but calm. "Sorry he fell asleep like this. I didn't want to disturb him." Callan stepped in slowly. "Don't apologize," he said. "It's the quietest I've seen him in days." Arya shifted slightly, but Evan tightened his tiny grip on her sweater. Callan watched the movement with a softness that surprised him. "You're good with him," he said quietly. "Better than I am." "You're his father," she replied gently. "That's what matters." Callan smiled faintly, though his eyes didn't quite follow. He sank into the chair across from her, the one he had used countless times during late-night feedings, but it felt different now. Less lonely, less hollow. They sat like that quietly, comfortably for a long moment. Then Callan said something he hadn't planned. "I didn't expect the house to feel this different with you here." Arya blinked, a little startled. "Different good? Or different overwhelming?" "Good," he said immediately. "Good in a way I haven't felt in a long time." Her gaze lowered. Compliments always felt too heavy. She gently shifted Evan so his cheek rested on her shoulder again. "He just needs consistency," she said softly. "And patience." "And you're giving him both," Callan replied. Before Arya could respond, a door downstairs opened sharp, hurried footsteps, followed by a voice calling out with just enough volume to cut through the calm. "Callan?" "Elise." Callan stiffened slightly. Arya felt it. He rose from the chair, smoothing his shirt. "I should see what she needs." He left the room just as Elise appeared at the top of the stairs. Her eyes swept the space, landing predictably, sharply on Arya holding Evan. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I see you're busy." Then, Arya stood slowly, careful not to wake the baby. "He fell asleep. I was just—" "Of course he did," Elise interrupted. "He seems to prefer anyone but me lately." The tone wasn't loud, but it held an edge that brushed too close to something darker. Arya said nothing. Callan stepped beside Elise. "Evan's doing better. That's what matters." "Is it?" Elisa replied, her eyes flicking to Arya again. Mrs. Klein approached behind her, sensing the tension like a dog senses thunder. "Bottle's warming," she said cheerfully, trying to lighten the air. Elisa didn't acknowledge her. Instead, she asked, "May I hold him?" Arya hesitated only because Evan stirred lightly at the sound of Elisa's voice. But she nodded and offered the child gently, carefully. Elise took him stiffly, as though unsure of her own arms. Evan whined not a cry, but a small sound of protest. Callan stepped forward immediately. "Elise, don't—" "I'm fine," she snapped. But Evan wasn't. His whine grew into a soft cry, then a sharper one. Elise bounced him awkwardly, her movements slightly jerky. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered under her breath. Callan's jaw tightened. Arya's hands curled at her sides, forcing herself not to reach out. Elise thrust the baby back toward Callan. "Here, he's impossible." Callan took him, steadying the child gently. "He's overwhelmed. You're moving too fast." "Elle?" Elise's eyes burned with quiet resentment, not at Evan, but at the scene she walked into. She turned abruptly toward the hallway. "I'll be downstairs." Her heels clicked sharply down the staircase, each step a punctuation mark of frustration. Callan sighed, bouncing Evan gently. Arya could tell he was torn between comfort, frustration, and a growing awareness he didn't know where to place. But neither of them knew the message Elise had received earlier that afternoon. A message from Grant. "We start tonight." Evening settled softly over the Reeves estate, filling the rooms with a muted lavender glow. Evan slept in his crib, and Arya finished tidying the nursery, her movements quiet and deliberate. She wanted the room to feel peaceful when he woke, something this house rarely managed on its own. Downstairs, raised voice drifted upward. Elise sharp. "Callan tired. Can't have her hear this much, Callan. It looks inappropriate." "Oh, she's helping," he replied. "Evan sleeps better with her nearby." Arya stepped back from the nursery doorway, not wanting to hear more. She didn't want to be a reason for tension. She folded a small blanket, keeping her hands busy while the argument slowly faded. A few minutes later, Callan appeared in the hallway. "You've done enough for today," he said gently. "You should head home soon." Arya nodded. "I just want the nursery calm before his next wake." Callan hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "You make things calmer. Not many people can." Before she could respond, Elise approached. Her smile strained, her eyes sharp. "We have dinner reservations," she announced. "We're late." Arya stepped aside as Elise looped her arm through Callan's and guided him down the stairs. Their footsteps echoed. Then the front door closed behind them. The house grew still again. Arya carried a basket of laundry downstairs, placing things neatly back into the cupboard. As she turned to leave, she noticed a downstairs window open a small crack. She frowned. Mrs. Klein never left windows open after sunset. Arya closed it gently. At that moment, the porch light flicked on. She froze. The front steps were empty. Yet someone or something had triggered the light. Her pulse tightened. The house had never felt this quiet, not even on the hardest nights. She took a step back toward the staircase, instinct urging her upward to the nursery, to the only place in the house that felt safe. And in the heavy stillness settling around her, Arya felt it clearly. Tonight, something was beginning, and she was alone in the house when it did. Night settled over Ashland with a stillness that felt almost too complete. The sky outside the Reeves estate was clear, the stars sharp against the dark, and the quiet pressed around the house like a heavy blanket. Inside, Arya moved through the softly lit hallway with careful steps, listening instinctively, the way a person listens when they sense something sitting just beyond the edges of ordinary sound. She checked the locks, front door, back door, the kitchen side entrance. Everything clicked firmly into place. Still, the uneasy feeling beneath her ribs lingered, subtle but insistent. In the nursery, Evan stirred, letting out a soft whimper. Arya hurried upstairs and leaned over the crib, humming the same gentle tune she'd used earlier. His breathing steadied, and she stayed a minute longer than necessary, watching the tiny rise and fall of his chest. When she finally stepped out of the nursery, the hallway felt too quiet again. She turned off the lamp, leaving the soft night light glowing like a faint ember, and walked toward the staircase. Halfway down, she paused. A sound drifted faintly from the back of the house. Not a crash, not a voice. Something small, like the whisper of movement. Her hand tightened on the railing. She listened again. Nothing. She swallowed slowly and forced herself to keep walking, reminding herself this house was large, old, filled with drafts and settling beams. But the feeling didn't fade. It stayed with her, sharp as a pinprick beneath her skin. She moved to the living room, gathering her bag. One more quiet sweep of the house, she thought. Then she would leave. She didn't notice it at first. The faintest shift of air near the back hallway. Then the softest creak of a floorboard, too deliberate to be the house settling. Arya froze. A slow breath left her. Not fear exactly, something colder, older. Instinct. She backed toward the staircase without turning her back to the hallway. When she reached the first step, she finally moved quickly, climbing the stairs with silent urgency until she reached the landing. She checked the nursery once more. Evan was safe, asleep, unaware. She closed the nursery door halfway and stood in the dim corridor, feeling the weight of the house settle around her one more time. She whispered to herself, barely audible, just one more hour, then they'll be home. Across town, Callan finished signing the check for dinner, though his thoughts had drifted multiple times during the meal. Elise had tried conversation, polished, laughter placed at the right moments, but something inside him felt slightly out of place, as if part of him were leaning toward home even while he sat across from her. When they stepped outside into the cool evening air, Elise reached for his arm. "Let's take the long way home," she said lightly. Callan shook his head. "I'd rather get back to Evan." Her smile faltered, just for a second. Then it brightened again, too quickly. "Of course," she said. "Whatever you want." They walked toward the car. Callan glanced at his phone. A habit now. No missed calls. No texts. Still, unease tugged at him, small but persistent. He unlocked the car, and they drove home beneath a sky full of quiet stars. In the back booth of the cafe, Grant watched them drive past through the window. He sat alone, coffee untouched, his phone face down on the table. When their taillights disappeared, he leaned back, a faint smirk settling on his face. "Step 2, he murmured to himself. "Let's see how far she bends." He tapped Elise's earlier message again. "She's alone in the house." He smiled as he whispered, "Good." Back at the estate, Arya lingered near the upstairs railing, listening carefully. The house remained silent now, but the porch light incident had left her alert in a way she couldn't shake off. She considered calling Mrs. Klein, but the hour was late, and she didn't want to worry her without reason. Just then, Evan stirred again. Arya hurried into the nursery and gently soothed him with her soft humming. His breathing calmed quickly, as if he recognized her voice even in sleep. A few minutes later, headlights swept across the driveway. Arya let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She stepped out into the hall just as the front door opened below. Callan's voice carried softly through the foyer. "Arya, you still here?" She descended the stairs, relieved but still unsettled. "Yes, I just finished checking on Evan." Callan nodded, studying her face more closely than usual. "Everything all right?" She hesitated. "Yes," she said eventually. "Everything's fine." But something in her voice, something she didn't mean to reveal, made him pause. Before he could ask again, Elise stepped past him, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood. "Oh, good," she said coolly. "You're still here." Arya stiffened slightly. There was something different in Elise's tone tonight, something calculated, something rehearsed. And for the first time, Arya felt certain. Elise wasn't just upset. She was preparing something that had already begun. Callan lingered in the foyer, sensing something unsettled in Arya, though she insisted she was fine. Elise stepped in with a too bright smile, thanking Arya in a tone that felt more like dismissal than gratitude. Arya gathered her things quickly, driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, and Callan walked her to the porch, asking once more if everything was all right. She gave the same gentle answer and left, her car disappearing down the quiet street, while Callan remained troubled in the doorway. Inside, Elise's expression hardened as she murmured, "You trust her too much," before retreating upstairs. Across town, Grant read Elise's text. She left. He's beginning to doubt her, and replied with cold certainty that they would push harder tomorrow. Driving home, Arya watched the empty road in her rearview mirror. But the uneasy feeling from the house followed her all the way to her small apartment. Something had shifted in the shadows of the evening, and though she didn't know what it was yet, she felt deeply that tomorrow would bring the start of something far more dangerous. Arya arrived early, hoping to shake off the uneasiness from the night before, but the Reeves house felt unusually tense the moment she stepped in. Evan reached for her the second he saw her, settling against her with a relief that caught even Callan off guard. And though he thanked her, he watched her with a quiet concern he didn't voice. Elise appeared soon after, polished and smiling too brightly, announcing vague concerns about the baby's routine in a tone that made Mrs. Klein shift uncomfortably. Arya sensed something calculated beneath Elise's sweetness, as if a plan were already unfolding behind closed doors. Down the road, Grant read Elise's text. "He's paying attention. Keep going," and replied that the next step would begin tonight. Holding Evan close, feeling how tightly he clung to her, Arya realized the house wasn't just unsettled. Something inside it was moving quietly toward trouble. As the day went on, Arya noticed small things that didn't sit right: doors left slightly ajar, a curtain brushed aside as if someone had been looking in, and Elise watching her with a quiet intensity that felt less like suspicion and more like preparation. Evan grew fussy whenever she stepped away, clinging to her shirt with tiny, trembling fingers. And Callan finally asked her gently, almost reluctantly, if anything had happened the night before. She wanted to say no, to keep the peace, but the truth hovered behind her silence long enough for him to sense it. Elise interrupted before either could speak further, insisting loudly that Arya take her break outside for some fresh air, though the request felt more like an order meant to remove her from the house. Down the street, a dark sedan idled near the corner, Grant waiting, watching the estate with cold patience. And as Arya stepped onto the porch, a breeze brushing her hair back, she felt it again, that same sharp instinct from the night before, only stronger now, as if danger had moved one step closer while the house pretended everything was fine. By late afternoon, the unease that had lingered around the Reeves estate all day began tightening like a quiet knot in the air, and even Mrs. Klein moved more carefully through the halls, glancing toward the windows as though expecting something to appear. Callan noticed it too, noticed Arya flinch at small sounds, noticed Evan cling to her with a desperation that felt deeper than simple fussiness, and for the first time he asked her, firmly, to stay close to the nursery while he checked the house himself. Meanwhile, Elise drifted in and out of rooms with an odd calmness, her phone never far from her hand, her eyes lingering on Arya with a look that felt almost triumphant, as if she was waiting for the final piece of something to fall into place. Outside, Grant's sedan eased a little closer to the house, hidden partly behind a row of tall pines, his gaze fixed on the upper windows, where Arya carried Evan in slow, soothing circles. She felt the shift, felt the house holding its breath, and whispered gently into the child's hair, trying to quiet her own heartbeat. And when Callan returned upstairs, saying quietly that a few things were out of place and he couldn't explain why, Arya knew this wasn't just tension anymore. Something had crossed into their world today, and whatever was coming next would not wait much longer. The house grew unnervingly still as dusk settled, and Arya felt a sharp instinct pull her toward the nursery just as Mrs. Klein called her name, worried, hurried, saying she'd found the back door cracked open again. Before Arya could respond, Elise appeared with a strange calmness, claiming she'd seen Arya near that door earlier, her eyes glittering with a quiet satisfaction that made Arya's stomach sink. Callan stepped forward, visibly shaken, torn between what he'd heard and what he'd seen all week, until Evan suddenly reached for Arya with a desperate cry that cut through every doubt in the room. Something in Callan jolted awake then. Every strange moment, every forced accusation, every whisper of unease snapping together as he realized who had truly been orchestrating the fear in his home. When he turned to Elise, the truth was already in his eyes, and she faltered for the first time, her composure cracking as Grant's headlights flickered outside through the curtains, revealing the shadow of a man waiting for her signal. Arya held Evan close, her own breath unsteady, and Callan stepped between them, instinctively, not out of duty, but out of a sudden, raw understanding that she had been protecting what mattered most all along. And as the house trembled on the edge of revelation, it became unmistakably clear. Whatever happened next would break something open, and nothing in the Reeves estate would ever return to the way it was. When all the dust finally settled in that old house, what remained was not the fear that once crept through the hallways, but the quiet strength of the people who chose kindness when it mattered most. Callan stood a little differently after everything, as if he'd remembered something he'd forgotten long ago, and Arya, with her steady heart and gentle way, helped turn a frightened home into a place where a child could breathe easy again. And little Evan, with his tiny hands and brave spirit, reminded everyone that sometimes the smallest voice can change the course of a life. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a tender one, soft like the glow of a porch light on a cool fall evening, warm enough to guide a weary traveler back home. The lesson is simple, yet it settles deep. Love that asks for nothing in return can reshape even the most wounded corners of a family. In a world that often hurries past quiet hearts, this story whispers that every soul deserves a place to belong, and that a single act of goodness no louder than a chair sliding across a kitchen floor at supper time can turn despair into hope. Like the gentle lamp flickering in a grandmother's window, sometimes the smallest kindness is the light that carries us through the darkest nights. So tonight, as you sit with your own memories, maybe a family dinner long gone, or the sound of children playing on an old front porch, I invite you to pause and hold this story close. And if it touched your heart even a little, consider sharing that feeling with someone who might need it. If you thought this story was meaningful, please comment 1, and if you feel it could be better or have thoughts to share, press 0.